Hello, and welcome to a story that defies convention and rewrites the rules of aerial combat. In the skies over the Solomon Islands during August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong faced a deadly ambush at 18,000 feet, spiraling into chaos as Japanese Zeros executed lightning-fast attacks, maneuvers that would challenge everything American pilots believed about flying and fighting. Could an instinctive, reckless move, an upside-down roll into a dive, save his life and change the face of air warfare forever? What if the most daring maneuver in history involved pilots flying inverted at perilous speeds, risking blindness, structural failure, or death, all to outwit an enemy more agile and experienced? How did a brief moment of redout, caused by negative Gs, become a secret weapon? Why did official training warn against such dangerous tactics, yet pilots kept doing them, risking everything? And what hidden truths about survival, physiology, and innovation emerged from the chaos of combat, revealing that sometimes breaking every rule was the only way to stay alive? Is it possible that a simple, instinctive move, one born from desperation, unleashed a tactical revolution that would shape fighter tactics for decades? And could it be that behind every daring inverted dive, there lies a deeper story of ingenuity, physiology, and the relentless drive to survive in the deadliest skies of world history? In this video, we will follow that path, separating myth from reality, uncovering how brave pilots turned forbidden maneuvers into powerful tools, and revealing the shocking truth about how inverted flight and negative G tactics transformed aerial combat across the Pacific and beyond. The most intense moments are about to begin, and the skies will never look the same again. At an altitude of approximately 18,000 feet above the rugged islands of the Solomon Chain in August of 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched with bated breath as his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiraled downward into the vast, endless Pacific Ocean below. A deadly ambush had been sprung upon them, as three Japanese Zeros had suddenly appeared from above, executing a swift and precise attack that forced the American aircraft into a chaotic retreat. Now, left alone in the vast sky, Bong found himself face to face with a single Zero, which was rapidly narrowing the gap to his tail, preparing to unleash its deadly payload. In response, Bong recalled the standard defensive maneuver drilled into him countless times during training: a decisive hard right bank coupled with full throttle, aiming to increase altitude and outmaneuver the attacker. Yet, this enemy Zero was exceptionally agile, turning more tightly and closing faster than expected. The Japanese pilot was already sliding into perfect firing position, with the 20mm cannon on his Zero aimed directly at Bong's aircraft. In those fleeting moments, Bong might have just 4 seconds before the deadly rounds tore through his aircraft's cockpit and armor. What transpired next defied every lesson etched into his training manual. Rather than executing the expected defensive turn, Bong performed a daring, unconventional move. He rolled his P-38 completely upside down, inverted in the sky, and abruptly pulled the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from danger, his aircraft suddenly dove downward, plunging into the uncanny silence of the ocean's surface. Because his plane was upside down, this maneuver directed him away from the expected response, placing him in a position the Zero pilot could not anticipate. Blood pounded in Bong's head as his vision blurred at the edges, turning crimson with the rush of oxygen deprivation and adrenaline. For 2 harrowing seconds, he was essentially unable to read his instruments, caught in a critical and confusing moment of combat. Eventually, Bong managed to level his aircraft again at roughly 12,000 feet. When he did, he saw the Zero above him, overshooting its attack run, completely out of position to fire. Remarkably, Bong had survived what seemed impossible. More than that, his instinctive and reckless move had inadvertently uncovered a tactic that would come to revolutionize aerial combat during the Pacific Campaign. This daring maneuver, born from instinct rather than doctrine, broke every established principle taught at flight schools across America. Official training and doctrine at bases in California and Arizona had vehemently warned pilots against engaging in negative G maneuvers, at the risk of engine failure, structural damage, or losing consciousness. The prevailing wisdom was that flight regimens should prioritize safety and follow predictable tactics. Yet, in the chaos of real combat, when a Zero pilot had achieved firing position, these warnings quickly faded against the imperative of immediate self-preservation. Any pilot who survived their initial encounters with these agile Japanese aircraft learned a ruthless lesson. Survival sometimes depended on embracing what was forbidden in peacetime instruction. The conventional doctrine of aerial combat was proving deadly. American pilots were dying because they fought the Zero according to rules designed for peacetime conditions, not the brutal reality of wartime dogfights. The Japanese aviators, meanwhile, had spent years honing their tactics through relentless combat over China, deeply understanding every advantage their Mitsubishi A6M0 possessed. They had exploited these insights for maximum destructiveness. American pilots, unprepared for such ruthless innovation, paid the price. Their aircraft and lives lost in confrontations that often seemed unwinnable. The story of inverted flight tactics and other daring maneuvers goes beyond mere combat history. It highlights a crucial truth about wartime perseverance and ingenuity. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively small cadre of skilled fighter pilots discovered that the human body could endure stresses that aviation medicine typically considered impossible, pushing the limits of both physiology and engineering. They uncovered that aircraft could undertake maneuvers previously deemed too risky, such as sustained inverted flight or sharp dives, without structural failure if handled with precision. Most importantly, these pilots proved that survival sometimes hinged on flying directly toward the enemy rather than away, a stark departure from traditional dogfighting doctrine. This raw, unvarnished innovation was born out of necessity, born from the unforgiving reality of the Pacific theater, where split seconds determined who would return home and who would become lost to history. The Mitsubishi Zero, introduced into combat over China in 1940, had already set a new standard for fighter aircraft. By the time the United States entered the war in December of 1941, Japanese pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours and were masters of their craft, perfecting tactics that capitalized on the Zero's speed, agility, and lethal armament. This aircraft's perforated airframe, lightweight design, and unmatched maneuverability made it the dominant fighter in the early years of the conflict. Such advantages were used to devastating effect, forcing American pilots into a critical re-evaluation of their tactics and training. The exceptional maneuvering capabilities of the Japanese Zero created a perilous dilemma for Allied pilots during the early stages of the Pacific War. When flying at speeds below approximately 300 miles per hour, the Zero could execute tighter turns than virtually any American fighter in the skies. Its turning radius at combat speeds was roughly 400 feet narrower than that of the P-38 Lightning, and almost 500 feet less than the F-4F Wildcat. This seemingly small difference in turn radius translated into a significant advantage in aerial combat, especially in dogfights where agility and maneuverability often dictated the outcome. In traditional dogfighting tactics, which were a staple of U.S. military aviation training, pilots were encouraged to maintain tight, decisive turns with their opponent, seeking opportunities to line up for a precise shot. The Zero's design made this approach particularly hazardous. A pilot flying a Zero could easily circle inside an enemy fighter's turn, gaining a positional advantage and quickly lining up for a convertible shot, firing from a position that was both safe and tactically advantageous. Early combat reports from campaigns over the Philippines and Java painted a grim picture for Allied pilots. American pilots frequently employed what was known as the boom and zoom tactic, diving from altitude, firing their weapons, and then climbing away to safety. This approach aimed to minimize the time spent in a turn fight, capitalizing on their aircraft's diving speed and energy advantage. However, when this initial attack failed to destroy the Zero, the American pilots found themselves at a disadvantage. The enemy's pilot would simply tighten the turn in a horizontal plane, maintaining agility and momentum. If the American pilot attempted to follow in pursuit, he would find himself on the outside of the turning circle, rapidly losing speed and energy, making him vulnerable not as a hunter but as prey. By the middle of the year 2042, the kill ratio, the number of enemy aircraft shot down versus lost, in some sectors had swung unfavorably, favoring Japanese pilots 3-1. Such statistics underscored the formidable threat posed by the Zero and highlighted the critical nature of its maneuverability advantage. Squadron commanders across the Pacific began submitting reports that recognized a stark reality. Defeating the Zero through traditional turning dogfights was exceedingly difficult, if not outright impossible under existing tactics. While aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine pilots, had advantages such as superior diving speeds and greater resilience to battle damage, they were hampered by sluggish roll rates, which limited their responsiveness in tight maneuvers. The P-40 Warhawk, known for its vertical performance, performed adequately in dives but struggled at the higher altitudes where many encounters occurred, compromising its effectiveness in the broader spectrum of aerial combat. The P-38 Lightning, boasting twin engines and heavy firepower, was formidable at speed and altitude but was hamstrung by its wide turning radius, rendering it vulnerable in close and horizontal dogfights. Each American fighter type possessed unique strengths, be it firepower, armor protection, or diving capability, but none could match the Zero's exceptional agility when it came to conventional maneuvering combat. Pilots were advised to exploit their aircraft's inherent advantages, avoid engaging in classic turning fights, and instead strive to maintain an energy advantage, taking advantage of speed and altitude. Such advice appeared logical and pragmatic, yet combat seldom unfolded according to the plan. The challenge was compounded by the exceptional skill levels of Japanese naval aviators in the early years of the war. Many of them had accumulated combat experience dating back to the late 1930s, giving them a significant edge in tactical fighting. These aviators had mastered energy management, knowing how to conserve or trade speed for altitude, and demonstrated expert-level proficiency in deflection shooting and tactical formations. They understood all too well how to maneuver their aircraft into positions where the Zero's extraordinary turning ability would be decisive. A typical Japanese tactic involved sending one Zero on a seemingly straightforward, level pass as bait, flying straight and appearing vulnerable, enticing the enemy to dive in for an attack. Once an American pilot committed to closing in, two more Zero fighters would swoop in from above or the flanks, catching the attacker off guard. Suddenly, the American fighter would find itself in a defensive posture, forced into a turning fight. That was precisely when the Zero's advantages became most evident. These tactics exploited the unforgiving mathematics of turning combat, which depended heavily on a fighter's turn radius, velocity, and G-force tolerances. The Zero's lightweight construction was a significant factor in its superior turn performance. By deliberately foregoing armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, features common to American fighters, it achieved reduced weight. This lightweight design allowed for sharper, tighter turns and greater agility. Conversely, American aircraft carried armor plates behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that increased survivability when hit but also added weight, which compromised their maneuverability. While these protective features could keep pilots alive after sustaining damage, they limited the aircrafts during the intense aerial battles of World War II. American pilots faced a daunting challenge. They had to confront adversaries who possessed a significant strategic advantage, superior aircraft designed primarily for survivability rather than agility. These aircraft, often heavier and with increased wing loading, had a larger turning radius, making fights more complex. Pilots were essentially asked to outmaneuver opponents whose aircraft could better sustain combat stresses and maintain performance under adverse conditions, while the Americans relied on planes that prioritized durability over maneuverability. In such a scenario, a solution emerged from a combination of desperate improvisation and serendipitous discovery rather than from formal aeronautical manuals or tactical doctrines. This innovation was the maneuver later known as the split S. It involved the pilot rolling their aircraft upside down and then pulling the stick downward to enter a steep diving turn. This move effectively transformed the aircraft's energy and positioning, providing a tactical advantage that could turn the tide of engagement. To understand the significance of this maneuver, one must grasp the nature of forces acting on pilots during flight. Under normal circumstances, when a pilot pulls g-forces in the positive direction, meaning their acceleration pushes them into the seat, the blood in their body is driven downward, toward the feet. As the g-force increases to around 5 or 6 times gravity, pilots often experience visual disturbances such as grayout or blackout, caused by blood temporarily leaving the brain. Conversely, when a pilot rolls their aircraft upside down and pulls the stick forward, they encounter negative g-forces. Instead of blood being pushed downward, it rushes toward the head, causing a phenomenon known as a red out. During red out, the pilot's visual field turns red because the blood vessels in the eyes become engorged from the increased blood volume. Early aviation medicine in the year 1942 suggested that humans could barely tolerate such negative g-forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs could produce severe discomfort, disorientation, and potentially cause retinal damage, leading to strict guidance to avoid inverted or negative G maneuvers altogether. These guidelines, however, were based on controlled experiments with test pilots in static environments. Combat situations presented a vastly different reality, where pilots often had to balance the risk of temporary visual impairment against the deadly certainty of being shot down. For example, a pilot experiencing just a brief moment of red out, lasting only a couple of seconds, could potentially escape a shot from a Zero fighter. But a pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight and remained within the opponent's crosshairs risked annihilation. It was not simply a choice between comfort and discomfort. It was a life or death decision of which form of visual impairment was less likely to be fatal. The effectiveness of the inverted dive maneuver was rooted in fundamental principles of energy management and battlefield prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a position directly behind the American aircraft, the so-called tail position, they would anticipate their opponent trying either to outearn them or climb a way to escape. Both options, however, had their pitfalls. Outearning the American aircraft was nearly impossible given the respective aircraft's performance, and climbing would only serve to drain the Japanese pilot's energy reserves, making the target easier to catch and shoot down. Instead of following the expected pattern, the inverted dive turned the scenario on its head, By converting altitude into speed through a steep descent, the American pilot created a velocity vector that the Zero pilot did not anticipate. More critically, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through this unconventional maneuver, their aircraft was subjected to structural limitations. Although the Zero was stressed and rated to handle positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, its lighter construction and design made negative G flight particularly hazardous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero increased the risk of structural failure or engine problems, since its systems were not engineered for sustained inverted operations. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison engines, also had a critical advantage in negative G situations. Unlike single-engine fighters that used carbureted engines, and were susceptible to fuel starvation during inverted flight, the P-38 employed fuel systems that functioned reliably under negative G loads. This difference was not an intentional engineering feature aimed at inverted combat, but it proved to be of profound operational significance. The P-38 pilot could maintain engine power during inverted maneuvers because its fuel injection and system design avoided the common problems faced by carbureted engines under such conditions. Thus, what initially seemed an improvised tactic, an aerobatic maneuver born of necessity, became a vital aspect of American aerial strategy. The ability for the P-38 to execute sustained inverted dives, with reliable power and structural integrity, gave American pilots a decisive edge in dogfights. It exemplified how understanding the deep physics of flight, combined with innovative application, could turn the tide amid the chaos of war, transforming desperate improvisation into a lethal and effective combat technique. The inverted dive maneuver became an intriguing tactic in aerial combat, particularly because some pilots experienced only fleeting moments of negative G forces during the execution, which paradoxically made the maneuver more manageable than previously assumed. While negative Gs can cause discomfort such as red-out, facial fatigue, and bloodshot eyes, symptoms generally considered intolerable, many pilots found that if the brief exposure was well executed and controlled, the human body could withstand it without serious harm. Indeed, during carefully performed inverted dives, pilots reported that the sensation of vision crossing into red-out lasted merely a few seconds before normal perception returned as the aircraft transitioned back into positive G flight during the pullout, although the process was undeniably intense. The discomfort during these maneuvers was considerable. Some pilots described the experience as physically harrowing. The symptoms, headaches, facial swelling, and bloodshot eyes, were uncomfortable but survivable. Several aviation personnel confided that they would rather endure a temporary, sharp headache back at base than face a potentially fatal confrontation or even a watery grave at sea. This simplified risk assessment was rooted in the stark reality of combat. Negative G maneuvers were painful but not necessarily deadly, especially when executed briefly and with precise control. In comparison, the pain inflicted by enemy weaponry was far more destructive. For instance, Japanese anti-aircraft artillery posed a much greater threat than the brief discomfort of contretemps with negative Gs. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby in New Guinea, became a pioneering figure in deliberately harnessing the inverted dive tactic, rather than merely reacting to it instinctively under duress. On a clear day, April the 11th, 1943, Lynch led a 4-aircraft patrol over Huon Gulf when his formation unexpectedly faced 80 fighters at approximately 20,000 feet altitude. Rather than engaging in the conventional horizontal dogfight, Lynch immediately performed an inverted roll as the lead Zero came into firing range. With quick, decisive action, he pulled the aircraft into a steep dive, accelerating past 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at around 8,000 feet. The pursuing Zero pilot, attempting to follow Lynch through the inverted maneuver, found himself unable to match his opponent's dive angle or speed and was forced to break off at a higher altitude, about 12,000 feet. Lynch not only avoided damage but turned the encounter to his advantage, reversing the tactical situation entirely. Once leveled out in a steep dive, he had gained both the altitude margin and superior velocity, resources he used skillfully to climb back and re-engage from below. Approaching the now less cohesive Japanese formation, Lynch's increased energy allowed him to descend from beneath, catching the disorganized formations off guard. The Zero fighters, misled into believing Lynch's squadron was retreating, were vulnerable to attack. Lynch succeeded in downing 2 of these enemy fighters in the subsequent engagement. The remarkable aspect of Lynch's tactics was that his wingmen, inspired by his bold example and executing their own inverted dives, survived the engagement without suffering losses of their own. An official after-action report acknowledged the successful use of the maneuver but did not explicitly endorse it, as formal military doctrine remained cautious about negative G maneuvers due to their perceived risks. What set Lynch's action apart was not mere luck but deliberate, strategic intention. He recognized the maneuver as a repeatable combat technique rather than a one-time shock. Within a short span of time, less than a week, Lynch shared his insights and demonstrated the maneuver to other pilots within his squadron during informal briefings. The instructions he imparted were straightforward. When faced with a Zero on your tail that cannot be shaken through conventional horizontal turning, roll inverted, pull through into a steep dive, accelerate to maximum speed, and use that vertical velocity to break away. His advice emphasized exploiting the vertical dimension. While the Zero aircraft excelled in horizontal turns, American fighters had an advantage in the vertical dive, especially when powered with maximum speed and energy. By June of 1943, this tactic had begun to spread beyond Lynch's unit to other P-38 formations operating from the Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Airmen frequently discussed the maneuver during squadron briefings and debriefings, sharing practical insights and refining their approach. Despite its growing popularity, the inverted dive technique remained unofficial, neither formally authorized nor explicitly forbidden, residing in a gray area of tactical innovation. It was embraced by some pilots as a valuable additional tool in their combat arsenal, with its use driven by necessity, ingenuity, and the desire to turn the tide in aerial battles where traditional maneuvers offered no guarantee of victory. The visual blackout occurred. This moment of complete sensory deprivation posed an extraordinary danger. It was a gamble where the pilot's quick judgment and instinct had to fill the void left by his momentary blindness. The inverted dive, more accurately called the split S, became a clandestine but invaluable tactic among experienced pilots, despite widespread hesitation to document its usage officially. Acknowledging its tactical importance, pilots and seasoned veterans understood its potential to turn the tide of a fight or escape overwhelming odds. Yet, many leaders hesitated to endorse such risky maneuvers in official instructions because of the potential liability. If, for example, a pilot was to lose his life during a split S, questions would inevitably arise about who authorized the maneuver, especially since it conflicted with the more conservative, formal training doctrines in place at the time. As a result, this technique disseminated mainly through word of mouth, experienced pilots instructing novices in the quiet confidentiality of the airfield or during informal conversations, without any official record or endorsement. When the 475th Fighter Group arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August of 1943, They received only informal briefings about the inverted dive maneuver, primarily from veteran pilots of the 49th Fighter Group who had already incorporated it into their combat repertoire. It was these seasoned aviators who demonstrated its use, sharing their knowledge discreetly, knowing the immense risks involved. One of the most notable advocates of the Split S was Major Charles MacDonald, who would eventually become one of the most prolific aces in the Pacific theater, with a total of 27 confirmed aerial victories. MacDonald later credited the execution of the Split S with saving his life on 3 separate occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 reveal a recurring pattern: engaging enemy Zeros from high altitude, executing a high-speed pass, and if faced with a counterattack during the climb back to altitude, rolling inverted and diving away to regroup on more favorable terms. This was not the classic, elegant dogfighting maneuver characterized by precise, calculated engagement. Instead, it was a pragmatic, almost industrial approach to survival, what could be described as an application of brute force efficiency rather than finesse. These pilots understood that victory in the skies was sometimes a matter of survival strategies, what they called survival mathematics, which sometimes involved risking immediate danger for a chance to live and fight another day. The physical toll of executing a negative G maneuver like the Split S was severe and largely unanticipated by traditional training manuals. Pulling -2 or -3 gigaseconds caused dramatic physiological effects, especially in the pilots' heads. Many pilots reported an almost immediate, intense sensation of pressure behind their eyes, followed by a phenomenon often described as the red out, where virtually their entire visual field turned a vivid crimson. The root cause was the engorgement of blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva, tiny blood vessels that, under the influence of gravity-defying negative Gs, filled with blood and pushed upward, creating a visual blackout almost instantaneously. During those crucial 2 to 3 seconds of red out, a pilot was effectively flying blind, relying solely on his kinesthetic sense, feelings of his aircraft's movements, and on memory of their instruments' positions to maintain control. This period of sensory deprivation was intensely risky. It required complete trust in previous judgment and a steady hand. In late 1943, Captain James Moorhead, a flight surgeon stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, documented the physical consequences of these daring maneuvers based on his examinations of numerous pilots who frequently employed inverted dives. The findings were consistent and alarming. Nearly all the pilots showed signs of petechial hemorrhages, tiny, pinpoint blood spots, sprinkled across their faces, particularly around their eyes and foreheads. Some exhibited subconjunctival hemorrhages, small blood vessels around the eyes that burst, leaving a reddish appearance that could last for days. Headaches were universal among these pilots, and a few reported temporary disturbances in their vision, blurred sight or difficulty focusing, lasting several hours after landing. While these effects were evident, Moorhead's unofficial assessment, which was never published in medical journals, concluded that although these maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, the injuries were not permanently debilitating. However, the greatest hazard lay precisely during those fleeting moments of blindness. In the split second when the red out obscured their vision, pilots could not see their altitude, airspeed, or attitude, the aircraft's orientation relative to the horizon, and certainly could not see the enemy aircraft or the terrain rushing toward them. The maneuver demanded unwavering commitment. Pilots had to precisely establish their dive angle, pull the necessary negative Gs, and then hold that control position until their vision cleared, a process that was as nerve-wracking as it was dangerous. This split second of sensory deprivation was a high-stakes gamble, an act of trusting instinct and previous experience to guide the aircraft through the blackness of temporary blindness. Misjudgment or hesitation during this critical interval could mean the technique known as the inverted dive, or rolling inverted, proved to be one of the most perilous maneuvers in fighter combat training, primarily because of the tragic accidents that occurred when pilots initiated it too close to the ground or sustained the dive for too long. In fact, executing this maneuver at altitudes of 5,000 feet left no room for error. A single mistake could prove fatal. Conversely, at higher altitudes, such as 15,000 feet, pilots had enough time and space to recover or correct their course, which made the maneuver not only possible but also somewhat survivable. As a result, mastering the mathematical calculations involved in timing and control became an essential part of a pilot's life-saving knowledge. Pilots quickly learned that plunging into an inverted position below 8,000 feet was generally too dangerous unless death was almost certain, due to the limited time and space for corrective action. Experienced aviators developed various techniques to minimize the duration of this dangerous readout phase. Some would tense their neck and facial muscles deliberately, attempting to constrict blood flow to their heads to slow visual blackout caused by rapid blood pressure changes during negative Gs. Others found that if they rolled inverted but pulled on the control stick more gradually, sacrificing some of the maneuver's speed and tactical advantage, they could maintain partial visibility throughout the rollback. This decision was a complex judgment call. The fastest escape from a close-range attacker required exerting maximum negative G force, which produced the quickest separation but often resulted in complete visual blackout, incapacitating the pilot. On the other hand, applying moderate negative G allowed some sight to be retained, but slowed the retreat, increasing vulnerability. In practice, most pilots prioritized maximum separation from their pursuers, accepting temporary blindness as a necessary risk. It was deemed far better to be blind and alive than semi-aware and potentially shot down. The fight against these internal fears extended beyond physical skills. It also involved overcoming deep-seated psychological resistance. Human instincts instinctively shun actions that induce pain or sensory deprivation, especially when facing imminent danger. Voluntarily diving into temporary blindness while under attack seemed counterintuitive to survival, yet through repeated exposure, pilots learned to override this instinct. The first few times they attempted the maneuver, the experience was terrifying, an overwhelming mixture of fear of death and the unfamiliar physical sensations. The second attempt brought similar fear, though familiarity gradually diminished the terror. By the fifth or sixth time, the inverted dive became just another challenging but doable aspect of combat flying, similar, perhaps, to managing fuel supplies, enduring anti-aircraft fire, or witnessing the loss of comrades. The body and mind adapted, making what once seemed impossible into a routine skill. In the brutal environment of wartime, where options often boiled down to life or death, what was once deemed too dangerous in training was suddenly a vital survival tool in combat. The inverted dive became an underground tactic, spreading silently and informally across the Pacific theater like an underground transmission, disseminated from squadron to squadron, never officially documented or formally taught in tactical manuals. By September of the year 1943, units flying P-38 Lightning fighters throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely instructing new pilots on the maneuver during their very first week in combat zones. This dissemination was largely informal. Seasoned combat veterans would quietly pull aside novices after evening messes, sharing insights into what proved effective and what could cost lives in the heat of battle. Squadron commanders often knew about this unofficial training but either encouraged it discreetly or chose to turn a blind eye, maintaining a plausible deniability in case higher command, such as 5th Air Force Headquarters, raised uncomfortable questions about unauthorized tactics. For instance, Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, which flew P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, formally incorporated the split S, an inverted dive maneuver, into his unit's tactical doctrines by October of the same year. Although the P-47 Thunderbolt was even heavier than the P-38 and thus at a disadvantage in turning combat against the nimble Zeros, its speed, especially during dives, offered a tactical advantage. The Thunderbolt's radial engine also handled the negative G-forces more effectively than some lighter aircraft. Kirby's pragmatic approach acknowledged these realities, emphasizing speed and escape capability over maneuverability, thereby enabling his pilots to utilize their aircraft's strengths in combat situations where quick, decisive actions were paramount. In the midst of intense aerial combat, certain tactics emerged as crucial for survival and victory, especially when traditional maneuvers proved insufficient. One such strategy involved the deliberate use of vertical flight techniques, notably the inverted dive, which became a vital escape maneuver for Allied pilots fighting against Japanese fighters during World War II. An influential figure in propagating this approach was a highly skilled pilot who explicitly warned his comrades that attempting to turn with a zero, that is, with the aircraft inverted relative to the horizon, would almost certainly result in their deaths. Instead, he advocated leveraging the inherent power and weight of the aircraft, particularly the formidable P-47 Thunderbolt, to dominate in vertical engagements. The suggested tactics involved diving from a higher altitude while in an inverted position, then pulling out of the dive at the last moment to escape enemies or gain an advantageous position. When properly executed, these vertical retreat maneuvers offered not only survival but the opportunity to counterattack fiercely. The pilot, whose tactical mastery was exemplified on October 11, 1943, personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft utilizing these techniques, cementing their effectiveness in combat. His daring and success earned him the Medal of Honor, a recognition of exceptional bravery and tactical ingenuity. The success of these tactics rapidly influenced the broader spectrum of Allied fighter units. Marine Corps squadrons flying the F-4U Corsair, which had superior performance in many respects over the Japanese Zero, adopted similar inverted dive approaches in early 1944. Despite the Corsair's impressive overall speed, firepower, and robustness, it still shared some limitations with other fighters, notably its turning radius, which was not as tight as the Zero's. However, pilots operating from island bases such as Munda and Vella La Vella soon discovered that the inverted dive was especially effective with the Corsair's design. One significant advantage was the Corsair's powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, which maintained thrust even during negative G maneuvers. This meant pilots could perform inverted dives without losing power, an issue often encountered with carbureted engines that would sputter or cut out during sustained inverted flight. Additionally, the aircraft's structural integrity allowed pilots to pull out of dives at higher speeds without fearing wing failure, a critical factor when escape was necessary under heavy enemy pressure. Prominent military instructors, including Major Robert Gaylor of the Black Sheep Squadron, dedicated time to demonstrating and teaching this maneuver repeatedly. He emphasized that the inverted dive was primarily a defensive tactic, a way for pilots to escape an unfavorable position rather than a technique to initiate attack. By mid-1944, The tactic had been so widely accepted that it reached Navy carrier fighter groups operating across the vast expanse of the Central Pacific. Pilots aboard aircraft carriers such as the USS Essex and USS Lexington were briefed on these inverted maneuvers, which increasingly became standard practice. The terminology used to describe this move varied. Some called it a split S, referencing the half-loop followed by a dive, while others used terms like negative G break, or simple descriptions like rolling out downward. Regardless of the label, the execution was consistent. When traditional defensive moves failed to shake off an attacker, pilots would invert their aircraft, dive sharply, and then roll out at high speed, conserving an altitude threshold typically around 8,000 feet. Below this altitude, pilots were cautioned to either switch to other escape tactics or accept the reality that they might be engaging in a fight-to-the-death scenario with the enemy. It is important to note that not all aircraft were equally suited for this maneuver. For example, pilots flying the F-6F Hellcat reported that their engines, which relied on carburetors, occasionally sputtered or cut out during prolonged inverted flight, although these engines generally restarted without issue. Meanwhile, Army Air Force P-40 Warhawks proved structurally sound for inverted dives but struggled with performance in a dive, often failing to generate sufficient separation from pursuing Zeros, limiting the maneuver's effectiveness in those circumstances. Such differences meant that the inverted dive was not a one-size-fits-all solution but rather a tactic tailored to the specific capabilities and limitations of each aircraft. For instance, P-38 Lightnings could rely heavily on their vertical escape strategies as a primary defensive measure, taking advantage of their high-speed performance and stability in inverted flight. Conversely, P-40 pilots had to depend more on other routes of escape due to their aircraft's structural and performance constraints. Despite the variations, the underlying principle remained clear and universally recognized within the Allied forces. When faced with a close pursuit, vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight, often provided a decisive advantage over horizontal turn fights. This approach consistently outperformed the traditional dogfight tactics in many situations, prompting Japanese pilots to become increasingly aware of this American countermeasure. By late 1943, intelligence reports from Japanese Zero pilots returning from combat indicated that American fighters frequently executed inverted rolls and high-speed dives to escape, a behavior initially interpreted by the Japanese as a deep within the strategic fabric of the Pacific theater. The deceptive nature of the Japanese aerial doctrine proved perilous for their pilots, primarily because it reinforced a set of tactics that, by late-stage warfare, no longer addressed the true threats they faced. One of the most misunderstood maneuvers was the inverted dive. Many Japanese pilots believed it to be akin to a retreat, a defensive repositioning, when in fact it functioned more as a calculated reset. This maneuver allowed American pilots the strategic advantage of selecting the optimal moment and method to re-engage, often on their own terms and conditions that favored their superior energy and positioning. Some bravely or perhaps foolishly attempted to shadow American fighters through these inverted dives, trying to match their speed and agility. Yet, this often ended disastrously. The lightweight construction of the Zero, which had initially granted it exceptional turning capacity, became a critical liability during high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's structure was pushed to its positive G limits, stressing the airframe severely, but it was particularly vulnerable during negative G situations, a flaw that compromised safety margins. Numerous Zero pilots who endeavored to follow American P-38 Lightnings through aggressive inverted dives experienced catastrophic control issues, such as flutter of the control surfaces or even structural failure. The aircraft's delicate balance was further compromised by engine problems. For example, during inverted flight, some Nakajima Sakai engines encountered fuel delivery difficulties, resulting in sudden power loss precisely when the pilot was trying to maintain visual contact with a hostile aircraft or execute a vital attack run. A particularly illustrative incident took place in December of 1944 over Leyte Gulf, illustrating how perilous these tactics could be in practice. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38, found himself engaged by 4 Zero fighters at an altitude of approximately 18,000 feet. As the lead Japanese Zero lined up for an effective shot, Maguire responded by rolling his aircraft inverted and diving, seeking to get below his attackers and gain the initiative. The Japanese pilot attempted to follow, striving to keep Maguire within the crosshairs of his guns. What transpired next exemplified the deadly game of energy management and structural resilience. As Maguire's P-38 accelerated past 450 miles per hour during the dive, it maintained its structural integrity despite the tremendous aerodynamic stress. Meanwhile, the pursuing Zero, which was optimized for agility rather than sustained high-speed dives, was subjected to severe vibration around 380 miles per hour, forcing the Japanese pilot to abandon the pursuit prematurely to prevent catastrophic damage or structural failure. Having leveled out at about 6,000 feet, Maguire regained his energy and re-entered the combat, decisively eliminating 2 of the 4 Zeros. The remaining enemy fighters disengaged, having underestimated the P-38's ability to exploit the situation. This incident exemplified the fundamental flaw in the Japanese approach. By late in the war, their most capable aircraft, the Zero, was no longer suited to the evolving dynamics of aerial combat, which increasingly favored high-speed, energy-rich engagements and vertical maneuvers. When the war commenced, the Zero's lightweight design and excellent maneuverability made it formidable at medium altitudes during sustained turning fights. Its characteristics were perfectly suited for those early tactics, providing an edge against the relatively less sophisticated Allied aircraft. However, as American tactics evolved, leveraging high-speed slashing attacks and vertical engagement techniques, the Zero's advantages rapidly diminished. Its deficiencies, lack of armor, fragile structure, and limited dive speeds, became critical vulnerabilities that overwhelmed its earlier advantages. In response to this tactical shift, Japanese aircraft designers attempted to adapt. They developed later variants of the Zero, which featured improved dive performance and strengthened airframes, along with new designs like the J-2M Ryuden, intended to meet the demands of high-speed, high-G combat. Yet, these aircraft arrived in limited quantities and too late to significantly offset the technological and tactical superiority of their opponents. Adding to this problem was Japan's inability to swiftly adapt its pilot training programs. By the year of 1944, Japan was suffering from a rapid loss of experienced fighters and pilots, which outpaced their ability to replace them. The training process was hurried and truncated. New pilots were taught basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics, but there was insufficient time or resources to instill advanced concepts of energy management, vertical combat techniques, or high-speed tactical thinking that could have kept them competitive in modern aerial warfare. Meanwhile, American training programs had incorporated lessons learned through combat experience, emphasizing energy conservation, strategic positioning, and vertical maneuvering to maximize aircraft capabilities. This disparity in training quality and tactical adaptation further widened the gap, making it increasingly difficult for Japanese pilots to effectively counter the evolving Allied air tactics and technology. By the end of World War II, the knowledge of inverted dive tactics, once a relatively obscure trick, had become second nature among modern fighter pilots, especially those operating in the Pacific theater. This shift was so profound that replacement pilots arriving in late '44 were already familiar with such maneuvers before stepping into their first combat missions, a testament to how deeply these tactics had become embedded in tactical doctrine. Initially, it was the Japanese pilots, who had been the most experienced and formidable adversaries early in the conflict, who now found themselves often less prepared than their American counterparts, as the tide of the war pushed the initiative into new realms of aerial combat. The inverted dive tactics, developed through relentless innovation during the tumultuous years from 1943 to 1945 across the vast Pacific, did not simply fade away at the war's conclusion. Instead, they persisted, integrated into the evolving doctrines of fighter tactics long after hostilities ceased. This survival and integration of the techniques owe much to the oft-unsung heroes of aviation innovation. Those brave pilots flying aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and the Grumman F-4F Corsair, who, fighting against insurmountable odds, devised strategies to gain a crucial edge. Although these innovative maneuvers were rarely explicitly credited at the time, their influence persisted into later generations of fighter pilots and training regimes. Fast forward to the Korean War, where American pilots employed similar tactics against the formidable MiG-15 fighters. These Soviet-built jets excelled at high-altitude performance and could outearn most American aircraft in a horizontal engagement. Facing these challenges, F-86 Sabre pilots resorted once again to vertical maneuvers and negative-G escapes techniques, reminiscent of the ones their predecessors used against Japanese Zeros. In these encounters, pilots would often execute quick inverted rolls and push the aircraft into negative-G regimes to break pursuit or gain positional advantage. Captain Joseph McConnell, the leading American ace of the Korean conflict with a staggering total of 16 confirmed kills, credited his survival in multiple dogfights to a maneuver he described as rolling out beneath the enemy aircraft, an explicit application of the same inverted dive concept that had been honed during the Pacific conflicts of the early 1940s. This tactic, which involved momentarily deploying negative-G maneuvers at high altitude and high speed, around 40,000 feet and 600 miles per hour, demonstrates the remarkable continuity of fundamental combat principles across different eras of aerial warfare. The lessons of inverted and negative-G maneuvers were hard-learned once again during the Vietnam War era. Early into the conflict, American pilots had been trained in missile combat at extended ranges, focusing on beyond visual range engagements that prioritized radar and missile technology. However, as they found themselves in close-range dogfights against agile MiG-17s and MiG-21s, they quickly realized their training in tactics like negative-G escapes was still critically valuable. Initial results in these close combat scenarios were less than stellar, revealing a gap that needed to be addressed. This recognition led to the establishment of the United States Navy's Fighter Weapons School, popularly known as Top Gun, in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar. The creation of this institution signified an institutional acknowledgement that mastering traditional dogfighting techniques, including negative-G defensive maneuvers, remained essential despite the proliferation of missile technology and digital targeting systems. The curriculum at Top Gun was a return to fundamentals, emphasizing principles that Pacific War veterans would immediately understand: leverage your aircraft's strengths, exploit enemy weaknesses, and when under attack, employ vertical and inverted maneuvers if necessary to escape or gain advantage. Modern fighter aircraft have been specifically designed with these principles in mind, incorporating advanced engineering features that make sustained negative-G flight not only possible but reliable. Aircraft such as the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the F/A-18 Hornet, and the F-35 Lightning II boast sophisticated fuel systems, durable engine designs, and structural reinforcements that allow pilots to execute negative G maneuvers without the limitations that plagued the older World War II aircraft. In addition, pilots undergo rigorous training in centrifuge facilities, where they develop resilience and tolerance for both positive and negative G forces, a critical aspect of modern combat readiness. The dreaded red out, a disorienting effect caused by blood pooling in the head during high G maneuvers, which had terrified pilots during the 1940s, is now a predictable and manageable phenomenon thanks to these advancements. Despite all technological and procedural improvements, the core principle underlying these tactics has remained fundamentally unchanged. Negative G flight enables maneuvers that opponents do not expect, thereby creating space, confusion, and openings for attack or escape. These techniques, rooted in the ingenuity of World War II and Korean War pilots, continue to serve as an essential element of aerial combat, illustrating how fundamental physics and pilot skill maintain their importance even amidst the rapid evolution of aviation technology. What makes the innovation behind the Pacific War truly extraordinary is that it emerged entirely outside the formal structures of military planning and official channels. This was not a case where an aeronautical engineer meticulously crafted a new tactic, nor was it the product of a strategic committee or a tactical development board that approved and standardized new methods before they saw combat. Nor did it find its way into training manuals or official curricula until after it had been extensively tested and proven effective by pilots themselves through hundreds of live combat encounters. Instead, these groundbreaking tactics spread through an informal, organic network of fighter pilots, a peer-to-peer dissemination of knowledge rooted in shared experience and survival instinct. Veteran pilots, with their first-hand understanding of aerial combat, mentored newer aviators, personally passing on vital skills and strategies in the cockpit or briefings, squadron by squadron. The men who devised and refined these improvised techniques often remained anonymous within their units, receiving little to no official recognition beyond their immediate comrades. Most of them never realized how profoundly their quick thinking and adaptive solutions would shape fighter combat doctrine for the following 8 decades. Consider Richard Bong, America's most successful flying ace with an impressive tally of 40 confirmed victories. His survival during the war owed much to his mastery of vertical combat, an innovative approach at the time, and his willingness to fly upside down when circumstances required. Then there was Thomas Lynch, who deliberately employed these tactics in combat and was tragically killed over the Philippines in March of 1944. His death was not due to a failure of his strategies, instead, it underscored a brutal reality of aerial warfare. Regardless of a pilot's skill or ingenuity, flying in combat remained an inherently deadly endeavor. The legacy of these unorthodox tactics does not rest on medals or formal commendations. Instead, it endures in the very training of modern fighter pilots, many of whom still learn to perform inverted roles and to endure negative G forces as fundamental defensive maneuvers. These techniques, born out of necessity amidst the chaos of Pacific dogfights, exemplify the spontaneous and desperate innovations that pilots had to develop on the fly, often rewriting the unwritten rules of aerial combat in midair, driven solely by the imperative to survive in a lethal environment.